Good morning. Welcome to Daunt Books. Welcome to a recording we're going to do this morning in place of a live event we'd hoped to have last night. We couldn't manage to make that work last night, so instead we're going to do a little recording this morning. And I'm delighted that Elif Shafak is here joining us this morning. She's managed to make it back in this morning. She is, of course, an award-winning writer of 17 books, 11 of them novels, including the recent Booker shortlisted 10 minutes, 38 seconds in This Strange World. And those of you who have seen her wonderful TED Talks will know what a wonderful public speaker she is. In everything that she does, she is a powerful advocate for women's rights, for LGBTQ rights, and indeed for freedom of speech generally. Elif, welcome to Daunt Books again.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to be here. This is one of my favorite bookstores in the world, so I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you, and it's lovely to be doing things back in the shop instead of staring at our screens back at home. How Stay Sane, it's a beautifully concise, what one might call prescription for what you describe as a contagious state of anxiety in the world. I think you've also called it a manifesto. It's a beautifully short book. You started writing it, I think, before the coronavirus struck. How did the coronavirus crisis, distill what you were writing and indeed change it?
It changed it enormously, actually, because I had a completely different outline in my mind. And when the lockdown started, I put that outline aside, and in a way I had to start it all over again from scratch. And in that sense, this is a book that very much at least tries to respond to that moment in time. I was trying to understand my own feelings, starting with anxiety, uncertainty, how do you deal with all that. So I think the tunnel that we are going through still, of course, it hasn't ended, very much shaped the book.
Yeah, thank you. It seems to me that throughout all the work that you've done, all your writing, you've been following your own prescription, because chief amongst the things you are telling us to do is to listen to the stories that have been told out there, and indeed to tell your own stories, just as you have done. But most important, I think, in the book is what you talk about is the unseen stories, the unheard stories, rather, which I think, as I say, in your fiction, particularly in 10 minutes, 38 seconds, This Strange World, they're a sex worker who is telling her story after she's in fact died and been murdered. That's really at the heart of all your work, isn't it? Telling the untold stories. Why is it so important? How can that help us now?
So I think I do very much believe, of course, as writers, we are very interested in stories, we love stories, and we chase them all the time. But I sincerely believe, in addition to that, we are drawn to silences. At least I know I am. So it's not only stories, but the silences in a society, in any culture, at any particular moment in time. There's a part of me that wants to understand where are the silences, what are the subjects that we find difficult to talk about, and who are the people who have been silenced. So rather than paying attention to the center, I think I like to pay attention to the periphery, to people who have been marginalized, disempowered, disenfranchised. And there's a part of me that wants to bring the periphery to the center and try to make the invisible at least a bit more visible.
And the danger in doing that is that we turn inwards, which is, you would say, is at the heart of what is going on now. But at the same time, one of the things that's been going on clearly is that some people's stories have been heard louder. Some stories have been much louder in this cacophony of voices all around us. Do you think there's a problem in trying to make sure that everybody's story is told? The people who are shouting loudest and telling their stories, often stories that they have been told are their stories rather than their own stories. But those are the voices that are cutting through.
Yes, and this is something that I think should worry all of us, because if we lose diversity and inclusion in our public space, that is incredibly harmful for any democracy. Because at the end of the day, democracy is not only about the ballot box, it's not only about political parties and the parliament, it's also about a good, robust civil society. It's about people feeling welcome, that they have a seat at the table and they are treated equally. It's about dignity. It has to be about justice, equality. I find all of these subjects incredibly important. They're not side issues. They're not, themes we can postpone or put in a footnote. They should be at the heart of all of our struggles, in my opinion. So again, it ties back maybe to what we were talking about earlier. Who are the people who are not invited to the table? What are the voices that we do not hear in our public space, especially as we move the ladder up?
But clearly, someone has to filter those voices. So, we can't listen to everything. When we look at some of the rise of populism in the past 5 years, what we've had, as said, is some less savoury voices that have cut through. If we are to hear other people better, if we are to hear the voices from the periphery, it follows that many of us, certainly on the progressive side of politics, are going to be hearing some voices they'd really rather not hear. Authors like you are going to take a more progressive view when they're looking for those hidden voices. Isn't there a danger that where we got to is partly because literature, culture hasn't had people representing those less tasteful voices, perhaps, which have then been at the heart of things, perhaps, that have gone wrong?
I hear your question. I find it very important. I think we all need to be willing to leave our own echo chambers and interact with people coming from very different backgrounds, especially as artists, as writers, but for all of us, for anyone who believes in coexistence, cohesion. These are incredibly important. But there is a danger, of course, especially with the digital world, digital technologies. What we have been promised was that each and every one of us was going to have an equal voice, which sounded great. This is not what happened in reality. Because of algorithms, in fact, what has happened is extremist voices, the loudest voices with no facts, have managed to not only shape the mainstream more and more, but also have more power than their numbers. So there's an inequality there, and we cannot be naive about it. We need to talk about social media. We need to talk about the dangers of disinformation, slander. And we are in a bookstore. I think for people like us, it's important to maybe emphasize that there's a difference between information, knowledge, and wisdom. We have way too much information, let alone misinformation. And the truth is we can't deal with it. It's too much. Our brains are not wired like that. We kind of skim, up and down. And we look on our Twitter feed, but we don't really stop and think about what we're reading. So rather than promoting more information, I would rather we focus on knowledge. This is why we need bookstores, books, in-depth analysis, investigative journalism. And then hopefully in the long run, of course, we need more wisdom, which also requires emotional intelligence and empathy.
Thank you. The problem there, of course, would be that access to books, access even to newspapers, access to wisdom is not equal. Certainly, it may be more equal perhaps in the West, but it's not equal everywhere. How do you deal with that issue? For a lot of people, a mobile phone is now their only contact with news. It's their only contact with any form of information, be it false information or not. We can choose to read books. We can choose to be informed through writing like yours. They can't. How do we deal with the problem of information when sources are so limited for some people?
True. And again, that comes back to inequality. So how do we bridge these gaps between, for instance, the centers, city centers and countryside? There is a widening gap there. If you're born in a different part of this country, your chances of accessing the job market or having a good education will be completely different. Let alone within the country, within the same city. We have seen with the pandemic, if you are born into a wealthier neighborhood in London, your chances of contracting the virus and perhaps dying from the virus will be much lower compared to someone who is born into a poorer neighborhood. So all of those inequalities, it also shows us that because we are aware of the importance of knowledge and how damaging it can be if we have lack of empathy, lack of knowledge, it also shows that libraries, bookstores, none of that is a luxury that you can postpone. Sometimes people say, well, at a time of economic difficulties, this is the main thing we should be talking about. This is one of the main things we should always be talking about. We need culture, we need literature, we need books. Also, then there are people who can access books, but they find information easier because it's faster, it's quicker, you can consume it faster. But especially for us who have access to books, but sometimes choose information, I think it's worth reminding that too much information is an obstacle in front of knowledge. It also makes us a bit arrogant. You know, we forgot to say, I don't know.
Yeah.
When was the last time we ever said, I don't know about anything? Ask me anything. Probably I don't know the answer, but I can Google it. And that gives me a confidence that in the next 5 minutes, I'll be able to say a few things.
That's right.
But in fact, I know nothing about it. So to be aware of the difference between informational knowledge and to understand that we need books now more than ever before, I think will also make us a bit more humble in life.
Absolutely. Now, another key element of your prescription, if you like, in here, is that we shouldn't see ourselves as having a single identity, a single belonging, I think is the way you prefer to talk about it, because that itself leads to the echo chamber and the staying with your own tribe and tribalism and so on. Could you say a little bit, the book is fascinating because it has little pieces of autobiography dotted without it. Many people know something of your background, but how many layers does Elif Shafak have?
Multiple layers, but I think it's not only me, it's nothing unusual in that regard. I honestly see every human being as composed of multiple belongings and multiple layers. And the reason why I emphasize this is because, again, sometimes especially populists say, well, that's a privilege, that's an elitist thing. If you have multiple cultures, it means you traveled a lot, that's a privilege. Not everyone who travels a lot or came into contact with different cultures is elitist or is part of the elite. We need to be careful about these generalizations. But I want to take a step further, and I want to say that you might have been born in the same town, maybe you got married in the same town, had your own kids in the same town, you still have multiple belongings. It could be the stories of your ancestors, you know, who they were 2 generations ago. We all came from somewhere, and all our family stories are full of migrations and relocations. But then also through your maybe sports or cultural or social affiliations, again, you have many layers. Maybe your sexual identity, maybe your political views. Add on top of that layer upon layer. So it's not a matter of, you know, people who are traveling have the privilege of saying we have multiple belongings. Each and every one of us does. But the problem is, in this age of divisive politics, we do not teach our kids or ourselves that we can have multiple belongings. In fact, we live in an age that requires us to belong in one singular tribe. And I think we need to fight against that, being pigeonholed like that.
Do you think, you know, without going into the whole cancel culture sort of debate, because I don't think it's very helpful really in talking about this, do you think, though, just to go back to that idea of who filters ideas, that since there is a filter out there on the internet and through social media, obviously some people would say, well, you know, we need ourselves to act as a filter. We need to decide, for instance, who will speak at university, because there are too many voices and too many of them are the wrong voices. And perhaps somebody needs to step in and say, no, you know, you are heard enough, or people like you are heard enough. We won't hear you here. We will hear other voices. Do you think that is increasingly a problem? Do you think you know, there is a better answer than the one we found so far?
I think we need a nuanced approach here, and that's the thing that I always want to fight for, nuances, you know. And more, especially on this issue, I am worried that we're drawn into 2 antagonistic camps, almost like clashing certainties. My approach is, I want to maybe share with our audience and readers, you know, I come from a country that has lost its freedom of speech, and the cost of that is enormous. We need freedom of words, freedom of imagination. we need to be able to connect across the ideological spectrum, listen to each other. So that, to me, is very important, defending freedom of speech. I do draw a line, however, when it comes to hate speech that incites violence. So if the speaker or a preacher comes and says, well, you are actually, tomorrow morning, go and put a cross on the doors of your neighbors if they have a different skin color, or if they come from a different ethnicity, or if they're gay, and if they're, so if that kind of, that is something else, because that really incites violence against vulnerable minorities and individuals who do not have the power to defend themselves. And we've seen that happening throughout history. But other than that, we should be able to engage into conversations with people with completely different views. On the other hand, I'm also aware of the hurt and pain that especially many minorities and young people feel, because they're saying, wait a minute, I was never invited to that discussion table. Why are my voices? Because they do not feel like they're represented. And we need to understand that hurt and that frustration as well. And we can do both things at the same time. While we're defending freedom of speech, try to bring the voices of the unheard more and more to the table, but always promote diversity of opinions. I think it can be done together.
So nuance is important. You would say beware of certainties. You mentioned Turkey. The problem is that Erdogan and so many others, we needn't go through them all, promote certainty, promote a false certainty in simplistic solutions, easy solutions. So many of those populists, and indeed so many of them who've done badly during this complex crisis,
very badly,
are men. Is there something, would you say, in the way in which women leaders who appear to have done well also have been the ones who have listened and who are not offering certainties?
I think what you're telling us is so important and so true. We've seen it with the pandemic. At a moment of extreme uncertainty, crisis, women leaders did far better in country after country. And one reason why they did far better than their male counterparts is because they are better listeners. And also they can empathize. I think empathy is so important, to be able to put yourself in the shoes of another person. We need to have that cognitive flexibility. Again, for that, we need to understand stories. Also, of course, countries that elect women leaders also have good civil societies, in the sense that they are more democratic, advanced societies. That too has an impact. So it's not only one person, it's a whole society that is open to following science, following facts, all of which is incredibly important. But overall, of course, female leaders have done far better, and they're better listeners.
One of the most interesting aspects of the book is the way that you look several times at what kind of a moment this is. And I notice you use the word liquidity to describe the state that we're in. It's something you use a lot in fiction. I think liquid and solid state is very important to you, I think. And it's very interesting. You talk about possibly too much optimism having got us here. We were too persuaded that liberal democracy was a straight line progression from the end of the Berlin Wall. Personally, I'm a pessimist, and sort of, like many pessimists, we feel that, well, this has turned out just the way you said it was always going to be. Do you think there is perhaps, though, in all seriousness, a role for more pessimism rather than blind optimism?
Yeah, blind optimism was dangerous. And also back then, especially in late 1990s, early 2000s, the biggest optimists were tech optimists. They would every now and then tell us that thanks to digital technologies, democracy would spread all around the world. Countries that seem to be lagging behind would sooner or later, have to catch up with the rest of the democratic world. And they would tell us that we would all live more than 120 years thanks to medical technologies advances. So it was a very different future that they portrayed. But the reality didn't work in that way. And actually, in fact, social media, digital technologies, they do have a very dark side that many of us didn't see early enough, because it was more vague, it was more unclear. But now before being too late, we need to talk about the dark side of digital technologies. So all I'm saying is, I think history doesn't necessarily go forward in a linear direction. We cannot take it for granted. We need to be aware of the fact that democracy is far more fragile than we assumed. And that means we all need to become more engaged citizens, more active citizens. I'm not saying partisan politics. I'm not even talking about party politics. If you don't like it, all respect to that as well. But to be engaged, to care, to be involved in the discussions, I think this is important. For that, we need a dose of pessimism, because a dose of pessimism will make me more aware of the potential dangers, more alert. But too much pessimism also creates apathy in the long run, because nothing is going to change. Too much pessimism brings me to that point when I don't believe that human beings can get any better or societies can be improved. That's a dangerous threshold as well, because it brings numbness. So we need a healthy dose of optimism simultaneously. And I think for that, it's difficult to find optimism at a moment like this. We need to talk with our fellow human beings, hear their stories of resilience. We definitely need books for optimism and hope. We need to be aware of stories, the art of storytelling, literature. So rather than going in, looking out and beyond, that will bring us more hope.
Is possibly one element of optimism, can it be derived from the fact that certainly younger people are looking beyond some of the crises we have now to the climate, obviously increasingly. They see that as the big challenge. And in a sense, might not all this that's going on at the moment, populism and so on, just be background noise, because they certainly sense that they've got to face this together. It will be a collective challenge, that it's only by working collaboratively across borders and across countries that an issue of that size can be solved. So might not what's going on with populism and some terrible leadership across the world be the last throes of our world, in a sense? Might that be one way in which we can look forward?
Absolutely. But that's the challenge in a way, because the old world is no more. It's gone. We find it difficult to accept this, but I think we need to accept it. The issue is the new world is yet to be built. We haven't built it yet, and we don't quite know how we're going to build it. So we're in this moment of in between them. And that moment of uncertainty can be very tiring. It can also be very scary. It can make people look for simplistic solutions and follow demagogues more easily. So it is an interesting crossroads. And we do not have the luxury of making mistakes when our planet is burning, when we have a massive climate emergency in front of us. And we have many other global challenges in front of us, which cannot be solved with the forces of nationalism. These are global challenges. So at a moment like this, I think we need to see the connections. Climate is related to the problems in our politics. When you have politicians who can't even utter the word climate emergency, let alone recognizing the fact and deciding to do something about it. So rather than focusing on a single issue, I think we need to focus on multiple issues at the same time, and definitely how to save our planet, how to think about the future of our children and grandchildren, and to that end, change our lives starting today. That should be definitely one of our priorities, at the top of our work.
Thank you. And at the heart of it all, as we sit in this bookshop, you would say, listen and read would be the most important things. Never stop listening. Never stop asking questions about the stories that are not right in front of you. Look to the edges.
Look to the edges. Also, as you said, doubt is so important. Never stop questioning, because without doubt, it's a dogma, and dogmas are dangerous.
Absolutely. Elif Shafak, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much.